So how did this man, who wasn't that much older than the Beatles themselves, and with no experience in artist management at all, how did he become the most famous and beloved rock and roll manager in music history? Well, here to discuss the life, career, and legacy of Brian Epstein is Beatles author Richard Buskin. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks very much. Glad to be back.
You know, whenever I read or listen to interviews with Brian Epstein, I always get the feeling that this was a man who was searching for his place in the world. I mean, he didn't long to work at his parents' record shop. It just, he just wound up there. But he did have this amazing skill, this eye for presentation, and it certainly came in handy when he took an interest in the Beatles. It's like he saw them and said to himself, I could mold this into something everyone would want to see and help these guys out and at the same time satisfy my own artistic ambitions.
He absolutely had artistic aspirations. This was a guy who loved classical music. Sibelius, I know, was among his favorite composers. He loved the ballet. He loved the opera, all the finer sort of arts. So, yes, he really did have a good eye, a good ear, and as you said, he really had an eye for presentation. In fact, when he was still managing his parents' furniture store in Liverpool, he would do very sort of creative window dressing that would be eye-catching to people.
Right.
And so early on he showed that eye, and of course we know that that's what he brought to the Beatles.
What's also unique about Brian, and it goes to show just how intuitive he was, the only role model he would have had in Great Britain in terms of rock and roll management at that time would have been Larry Parnes with his stable of stars, but he would micromanage his clients and change their names and even right down to telling them what songs to record. And Brian was, very heavy into presentation, but when it came to the music, he was more or less hands-off.
Oh, yeah. Larry was a very sharp businessman. In some cases, a bit too sharp for his, own clients because he would often rip them off. He also was a sexual predator with a lot of his clients.
Yeah.
That said, he was hugely successful. Before Brian came along in the UK, he had to be the manager, on the pop scene.
Right.
With, as you say, his stable of artists with all, as Paul McCartney described them, people with furious names. Right. And, as you said, though, he was very much the anti-Brian because Brian was a very ethical guy. He was a businessman, but he was ethical, and he was good to his word, and he showed that time and again. I know there's been some suspicions of misdealings by Brian, but really, I think he comes out of it pretty clean. And in that regard, he's a polar opposite to Larry Parnes. And I mean, let's face it here, the Beatles wouldn't have been told what to do anyway. I mean, getting them into suits was tough enough,
right?
But start encroaching on the music, and you've got another problem there. And that's why it would have never worked with a Larry Parnes. Mr. Parnes Shillings and Pence, as a documentary titled him.
Right.
But with Brian, it was just, down the line, it was a fantastic relationship. I know that sometimes they gave him a bit of a hard time. That's who they were. But he did very much stick to what he knew best and let them get on with it.
Right. One
thing where Brian really got the short end of the stick is this notion that festered over the years of him basically acting as Svengalian, making strong suggestions as to what they should be presenting at the Decca audition.
Right.
And that it was Brian's choice of, novelty songs to show them as all-round entertainers. That was the problem. I don't think that really holds much water. I think, they made their own choices here. He may have made some suggestions, but they wouldn't have done anything they didn't want to do. And furthermore, what became really clear in Mark Lewison's Tune In book was that, after that initial burst between Lennon and McCartney of writing songs in the late 50s,
right,
they then stopped writing songs, and they were just purely a covers band until Brian came along, and he was the one who, obviously having heard that they did some songwriting, encouraged them to go back to it.
When Brian finally got the Beatles a contract with EMI Records, and George Martin told the group that he wasn't thrilled with their drummer. That's when Brian had to do his first unpleasant task as their manager and get rid of Pete Best and bring Ringo Starr in. Obviously, they left him to do the dirty work for them.
Yeah, they did. And in fact, if again in Tune In, it turns out that they did the same with, I think, one of the Quarrymen.
Yeah.
You know, they got the then manager to fire him. So that pattern was, set fairly early. And Brian did the bidding. I mean, Brian couldn't have been a softie. Right. That's the other thing. In these biopics that we always see, he's presented as this sort of wishy-washy guy. Brian was anything but. He was made of pretty strong stuff, stern stuff. To stand up to the Beatles, he had to be. He couldn't be a pushover. But he presented himself really well. And, he knew what to do that was always in the best interest of the group.
Everybody knows the story about how when the Beatles were in Hamburg and they were feeling down, John would say, "We're going to the toppermost of the poppermost." I mean, they had confidence in themselves. But Paul McCartney said in the 8 Days a Week documentary that Brian saw an even brighter future for them than they even did.
Because they had amazing faith. I mean, to hear George in Anthology say, "We always knew we were going to make it."
Right.
That's an amazing thing to say, really. I don't think the people around them thought the same thing.
Right.
But Brian did. This whole thing about they're going to be bigger than Elvis. He meant it. That wasn't, BS on his part. He actually meant it. And he did love them. That's the other thing. And forget all these, connotations about his homosexuality. Brian truly loved the Beatles. He loved the music. He fell in love with that music, and he loved them. And he gave it everything. That's why, he went to lengths that other managers would have never gone to get them a recording contract.
I wanted to ask you how the whole thing got off the ground, because everyone the world over is talking about the absolutely phenomenal Beatlemania, which has just swept, and it's not just England, it's everywhere.
Well, it started way back 2.5 years ago in Liverpool, almost from sort of nothing. The boys were popular locally, but they hadn't been seen anywhere outside of Liverpool except in Hamburg, where they played very long hours for very little money for many months, and I think that was probably where their sound was knit together. And then I started with them in Liverpool and promoted them in sort of every possible way, and the whole thing snowballed.
That is the important thing to me, though, the promotion. Now, this was your whole idea, was it? Did one thing just stem from another?
One thing stemmed from another, but you must remember, although I promoted them as only a manager can do, and I left no stone unturned, at the same time, I was handling what I believe to be the greatest talent in the world. And I wouldn't like it ever to be thought that I could have done what has been accomplished with the Beatles with talentless people. After a few months, I decided that in order to add to their importance and my importance as a manager, it should be a good thing to be able to offer promoters and people in the business other acts. And it was with that in view, and also with the knowledge and the delight that I came across another group called Jerry and the Pacemakers.
And suddenly Brian finds himself the captain of Merseybeat. I mean, he's managing Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cilla Black. I mean, he's really got his own stable of stars there.
Yeah, I mean, again, he spotted a good thing and he knew how to capitalize on it. That said, he also knew when their star was waning a bit. And I know that there was resentment by a number of his artists that, of course, the Beatles were on the A-list, that they'd never make it to.
One of Brian Epstein's discoveries, Cilla Black, with her 1964 UK #1 hit, You're My World. We've been talking with Beatles author Richard Buskin about the life and career of Brian Epstein, and we've gone over the successes, but there were some accidents, to put it politely. Most notably, the Cell-Tab merchandising deal, which saw the manufacturers making the lion's share of the profits, and the Beatles getting a small portion.
Yeah, he was absolutely furious when he'd realized what he'd signed up. I mean, one wonders how his solicitors or whoever, didn't look this stuff over, because the reaction is as if he didn't realize. I think he knew, but he didn't realize what a bad deal it was. He was led to believe that this was the standard deal,
right,
and didn't check that, obviously, with anyone in the know, and the rest is history. But there's no real precedent for anything on this scale. And he did try and surround himself with good people. It's not as if he was just trying to do this all on his own.
Right.
He did try and surround himself with good people, but they were out of their depth amongst some sharks. And so, the Beatles lost a lot of money. They've made a noise about that, which I don't think is really very fair. They did okay in the end, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. I know that Brian's personal life was one of utter turmoil. I know that he was attracted to unsavory characters, let's put it that way, who would do some harmful things to him. I know there was a story in America about a briefcase, and there was some guy who was going to expose the contents and expose Brian's homosexuality to the world. And I believe in England at that time it was illegal.
It certainly was, up until 1967, I think, in England. Before that, it was disastrous for Brian. Basically, before even, the Beatles got famous, he got busted for lewd conduct in public and stuff like that. And Brian's problem in his private life was that he was attracted to what was commonly known as rough trade, as you say, that he would often get beaten up and mugged and blackmailed, and then in America, as you say, extorted. It was horrible. It was a real mess. And then you add to that, as John said, that he often felt guilty long after Brian gone because he'd been the one who'd introduced him to drugs.
Right.
So you've got this troubled soul now taking drugs, drinking, gambling. It wasn't pretty.
So Brian Epstein dies on August 27th, 1967, and it's reported as an accidental overdose. But there's always been this lingering question about, was it truly accidental? Was it suicide? What do you think?
Votes out on that for me, because it may have been accidental that night, but we do know that there were several suicide attempts, and that kind of puts us in very similar territory with Marilyn Monroe.
Yes, yes, exactly.
What happened at the end there? Was she murdered? Was it an accident? But we do know that, she'd played or flirted with fire more than one time, and that's what happened with Brian. So, again, everyone sort of around him. I've spoken to Peter Brown and said, they had no idea that he would have been that depressed. But then again, people don't always communicate what's going on inside their heads. So I really don't know. My guess is that it was accidental, but I also feel that it was most likely a disaster waiting to happen.
There's very famous news footage of the British press interviewing the Beatles just after they learned about Brian Epstein's death, and they all seemed shell-shocked, but John Lennon most of all, and he was the closest to Brian. John seems like he is completely lost.
Yeah, because, John, I think, was always in search of a father or mother figure, a parent figure. He never had one, apart from his Aunt Mimi. And so there is a pattern in John's life, okay? There's Cynthia, and there's Brian, and there's Maharishi, and that doesn't work out, and then there's Yoko.
Right.
And as he said in 1970 to Jan Wenner Rolling Stone, that, I knew we'd had it, when Brian died, because I didn't have any illusions as to our talents as business people. But, there's a really, really telling remark in that interview, because as you said, John looks sort of as if his eyes are glazed over, doesn't he? He looks like he doesn't quite know what's hit him. I'm sure that's what the case was. And he says he was one of us.
Yes.
And how many people would they have said that about?
Yes, very few.
You know,
Very few.
Yeah, that said everything, actually. As typical John, right? Concise and to the point.
You have to wonder, had Brian lived, how differently things would have turned out. I know that the very next project the Beatles went into right after Brian died was the Magical Mystery Tour movie, and that was utter chaos. And I have a feeling, had Brian been around to handle that, it would have been a very different story.
Yeah, exactly. And also, one just can't see the Apple disaster ever having happened like that.
Right.
With Brian, and then the fallout and Northern Songs fiasco, all of that stuff was post-Brian, okay? It was, as John said retrospectively, he knew that they'd had it, and they had.
Yeah.
No one would have fought for the Beatles like he did, and no one would have shaped them the way he did. And then even, towards the end of his short life, look at what a fabulous move he made with the Savile Theatre.
Yes.
Where he gets this theatre in the centre of London and starts booking these really fantastic, cutting-edge rock acts. So that was a hint as to what the future would have been with Brian. I don't think he would have sort of slipped into the distance, as the Beatles star waned or anything. I think he would have had a long future.
Well, Richard, I want to thank you so much for coming on and spending some time with us today talking about Brian Epstein. And I want to give you a chance to tell everyone about your brand new podcast, Swinging Through the 60s.
Well, yeah, this is a new podcast I'm co-hosting with Eric Taros, good friend of mine. He's based in the Boston area. I'm in Chicago, so we do, sort of live hookup.
Right.
And we've had 2 episodes so far. The first one was about July the 20th, 1969, the night of the moon landing, and a lot else happening around that.
Right.
And then the second episode was John Lennon's White Album, taking all of John's tracks on the White Album, adding the Revolution single, and making a single album out of that, with a view to doing the same for Paul, another show, and then a third show will be about George and Ringo's White Album, which is all of George's tracks, Ringo's 2 tracks, that's, 6 tracks there,
right,
and then the George tracks that didn't quite make the cut. So we've got this great thing going here. We've got, really wide scope, 1960s. We can be talking about film and music, the politics, the fashions, the culture of the times. And so, we're really excited about this. We're getting a great response so far, so onwards and upwards.
And I would say to the audience, they even mentioned the Carry On films.
We absolutely did. I just love it when I hear someone with an American accent talk about Carry On films. It should be a source of embarrassment, but it isn't.
Right, it should be pride. Tell us where we can hear the Swinging Through the 60s podcast.
So it's on all of the podcast apps. You can get it through iTunes and SoundCloud and whoever. But also on our website, www.swingingthroughthe60s.com.
Richard, I want to thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us today about Brian Epstein.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. Thanks for having me.